This is Balance of Power. I'm Taylor Riggs in for David Weston with Kevin Cirilli joining shortly. In just a few moments, the New York Stock Exchange will observe a moment of silence to coincide with the start of George Floyd's funeral and to express support for equality, justice, and human rights. The silence will last for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. That's the length of time prosecutors say Floyd was pinned to the ground. The moment of silence begins with a single strike of the bell. The New York Stock Exchange observing an 8-minute and 46-second moment of silence, coinciding with the start of George Floyd's funeral in Texas. This is Bloomberg.
Really in Washington.
And I'm Taylor Riggs in New York. Let's get a check on those markets now. And joining us is Kaylee Lines. And Kaylee, earlier it seemed very risk on, yet the tech sector is showing some resilience midday.
You look broadly at the equity market, the S&P 500 is lower by about 0.8%. In some ways, maybe it's no surprise we're taking a bit of a breather here, considering how far we have run. Of course, this index yesterday had erased all of its gains for losses, for the year as of the close. But today we're taking just a leg lower here as markets kind of evaluate the fundamentals and have we run too far too fast. But you mentioned that tech outperformance, Taylor. The NASDAQ is still higher by about 0.2%, really being led higher by the likes of Apple. It's higher by nearly 3%. That on a report that the company is set to announce it's replacing Intel chips with its own processors for Mac computers. That announcement could happen as early as the next few weeks. And then you also have other tech heavyweights like Amazon, Facebook, all leading the tech sector in particular higher. It's so interesting. We're seeing a total reversal of that cyclical-led trade that we've been seeing in recent weeks. Now it once again is tech underperforming while energy and financials are lagging on the day.
And Kaylee, this is what makes markets. Yesterday, all we could talk about was the 10-year trying to hit up against 1%. And then today you wake up and it's fallen back down to 82 basis points. What happened?
Yeah, you're seeing some of that bid come back into the Treasury market. Of course, this is a market that is very much anticipating the Fed's commentary decision tomorrow, what they're going to say about possible curve control, etc. But as you said, the 10-year yield is lower for 2 days now. It's down right around 81 basis points. It's down about 5 basis points in today's session. We'll see as the curve kind of flattens out a bit, but we had seen really aggressive curve steepening in recent weeks. So we'll see what the Fed has to say tomorrow. I think the market is kind of waiting and watching at this point, Taylor.
Thank you, as always, there to Bloomberg's Kaylee Lines. Kevin?
The eyes of the nation and the world are fixed on a church near Houston, Texas, where a private funeral service is set to begin for George Floyd 2 weeks after his death at the hands of Minneapolis police officers. This also comes as Republicans on Capitol Hill are raising the prospect of defying election year predictions to work with Democrats across the aisle to overhaul the nation's police laws. For more, we're joined now by Bloomberg government congressional reporter Emily Wilkins. Emily, we're watching these images of this funeral, but I'm very curious, can Republicans and Democrats find common ground to get to some type of legislation?
Democratic leaders are absolutely hoping so. Just now, Congress Majority Leader Steny Hoyer was talking on the phone with reporters, and he really emphasized how much he wants to work with Republicans, how he hopes that Republicans offer their own feedback, how they're able to work together in committee. Remember, this bill was introduced yesterday. They still need to go through a hearing process as well as a markup process. So it's going to be a while, and probably not until the end of this month at least, until we see this bill being voted on. There is still opportunity for it to change and for Republicans to perhaps start to support it.
So, Emily, but when I spoke with a couple of Republicans in the past couple of weeks, including 2 members of Congress, they said that on the issue of defunding the police, non-starter, even Biden says non-starter on defunding the police, but on the issue of looking into cops who have a record of racism, that's something that they would be able to get on board with. Is there any appetite to just look at that specific piece of this puzzle, at least to just get some type of bipartisanship through?
It's always interesting when bills get negotiated in Congress because a lot of times there is concern, and this comes from both sides of the aisle, that they're going to pass the one thing that everyone agrees on, and then everything else is never going to get done. You have seen Democrats, they are cognizant that defund the police is not exactly sort of a popular slogan with many people, even though a lot of people note that defund the police does not necessarily mean do not give any funding to the police. But Democrats have put forward a number of other sort of maybe middle of the road issues that they're hoping they can come to an agreement on. Things like bans on the chokeholds that were the ones used on George Floyd, bans on no-knock warrants that were used in the killing of Breonna Taylor. So they aren't going sort of to the far left calls of quote unquote defund the police. They have put forward a package that they are hoping that they can get some support on from Republicans.
Emily Wilkins, Bloomberg government reporter, our thanks to you for all of your excellent reporting, to you and your team. And we turn now to Mark Crumpton from Bloomberg First Word News. Mark?
Kevin, thank you. As you mentioned, George Floyd will be buried in his hometown of Houston, Texas today. Mr. Floyd's death last month sparked nationwide protests over racism and police brutality. His funeral is getting underway at this hour. It will be private. On Monday, about 6,000 people attended a public memorial service to Mr. Floyd in Houston. President Trump has lashed out at that elderly protester who was shoved to the ground and seriously hurt by police in Buffalo, New York. The president tweeted that the 75-year-old man was a, quote, provocateur who exaggerated his fall. The president did not offer any proof for his claim. Mr. Trump is hoping to get back on the campaign trail soon. He tweeted today that rallies will be starting again soon. They've been on hold since March due to the coronavirus pandemic. Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden has begun to resume events, but he limits the number of people in a room to practice social distancing, and he wears a mask. President Trump has mocked the former vice president for wearing a mask. Mr. Trump does not cover his face in public. The coronavirus is spreading faster in South Asia than anywhere else in the world right now. Over the past 24 hours, infections have risen by 27% in Pakistan, 19% in Bangladesh, and 17% in India. That's according to data compiled by Bloomberg. Pakistan and Bangladesh also had their single biggest daily spike in fatalities. Countries across South Asia have started to ease their virus lockdowns in the hopes of reviving their economies. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
Thank you, Mark. And still ahead, we'll dig into the Democrats' police reform bill and the prospects for bipartisan change, all ahead of the November elections. And we do this with Jamil Jaffer of George Mason University. All of that next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm Taylor Riggs in New York.
And I'm Kevin Cirilli in Washington, D.C., with House Democrats now pushing their police reform bill and Republicans aiming to release their own plan for overhauling the nation's policing laws. Where are the areas of common ground on this highly charged issue? For more, we're joined now by Jamil Jaffer. He is founder of the National Security Institute at George Mason University School of Law. He's also, of course, a senior vice president at IronNet Cybersecurity. All right, Jamil, we just heard from my colleague, Emily Wilkins on Bloomberg Government's team, that there actually are areas of bipartisanship. But can those areas of bipartisanship get inked into legislation and signed into law by President Trump?
Yeah, it's a great question, Kevin. You know, one of the challenges is that Democrats control the House. They'll obviously be able to get a bill that they want through. It'll go to the Senate. The Senate will be controlled by Republicans. Will inevitably come up with something different. The question will be then, how do they reconcile those differences, and what can they do to get a president on board who's clearly expressed a view of the role of the police and potentially the military in these responses that I think is different than where both Republicans and Democrats in the House and Senate are today.
You know, I want to forget about the politics for a second, because there is pressure on suburban Republicans to get something on this issue through. But right now in Houston, Texas, where the memorial service is occurring for George Floyd, and we just came out of the New York Stock Exchange where an 8-minute moment of silence in recognition of George Floyd, this just appears to be almost a watershed moment, does it not, for there to be some area of bipartisanship? What would that look like?
It does, Kevin. You know, I think watershed moment is exactly the right term to use. I don't think anybody expected the reaction we saw from the community and communities across the country and the popular response from corporations and from the public sector. We have seen a dramatic change in just, days on this issue. And so I do think there is for bipartisanship. Look, I mean, I think that the question of the use of body and dashboard cams, I think, is sort of a minimum starting point. The question about chokeholds and what you do on those things, appropriate training, accountability for officers, and the like are all things that I think are clearly bipartisan. We'll find some consensus. The details of that, the questions on the harder questions like no-knock warrants and other making other things federal crimes, I think are much harder questions that have been long fought. But I think there's a lot of room for bipartisan compromise and getting the bill to the president's desk that he can and should sign.
Jamil, what is the case for national federal legislation versus the state-by-state approach?
Well, Taylor, I think that one of the issues here, obviously, is that we've seen that this is a national problem in terms of institutionalized racism, right, and the behavior of some members of law enforcement. And so it's not just a localized problem. And I think you've seen it through the nationwide protests, right? You've seen a national response, and I think that we will ultimately see federal legislation that uses the fact that the federal government provides a tremendous amount of money to localities in terms of police funding and the like, and they'll condition that funding on the adoption of certain changes. They'll also make changes to federal law. So I think there is an opportunity here, Taylor, for some changes to federal law. At the end of the day, though, you're right. This has to be implemented locally, and that's where we got to make sure that we have good standards and common sense reforms locally, and not complete defunding. I mean, that simply doesn't make sense either, Taylor.
I want to pivot here because given that we're in the middle of a pandemic, we've been talking a lot about mail-in voting versus crowding at polls. What are some of the fraud and concerns around mail-in voting? Are those legitimate?
Sure. Look, I mean, Taylor, there's been a long-standing concern about mail-in ballots. We've expanded them dramatically over the years in order to help our military overseas and the like. And those ballots we tend to think are sort of more secure because they're coming from military outposts and the like, coming straight to the federal system. There are concerns that ballots might be stuffed through mail-in balloting. And so these are concerns that have been expressed for years. With the massive expansion we're seeing today post-COVID of mail-in balloting, that's what's raising the concerns, right? It's much easier if you have somebody presenting a photo ID at a voting booth to verify they are who they say they are than it is to figure out who's mailing in ballots and whether they're being mailed as a group and multiple people filling them out and then sending them in. That's obviously a huge concern, and we've got to figure out ways to address that concern, Taylor.
Let me pick up on that with what Taylor was talking about, because, I mean, we're 5 months out from Election Day. Shouldn't we have been preparing for mail-in voting years ago if this was the direction that our country was going to move in?
Well, Kevin, you're exactly right. Look, I mean, obviously, we've had significant changes in mail-in voting over the years. We have now same-day registration, which raises a lot of concerns in same-day voting. After the 2000 elections, the Bush v. Gore debacle, we saw the ability to cast provisional ballots. So there's been a lot of changes, but you're right. I mean, you would have thought we'd be ahead of this. Now, look, let's be fair. Obviously, the COVID thing has been a dramatic change for all of us working from home and, being social distancing and the like. So, it's a different environment, and we'll see how this plays out. I do think the question will be, if we do have a massive change in favor of mail-in voting, which it looks like we will, what's that going to do to people's concerns about whether they had a valid election, And I think there will be people who will contest these elections as a result, potentially starting at the top of the ticket, and that could cause huge problems as we go post-November into the inauguration period.
Well, our thank you is always there for all that perspective from Professor Jamil Jaffer of George Mason University School of Law. And a quick note, today marks the launch of Bloomberg Green magazine. It's a quarterly collection of our best reporting on climate change. The magazine is available on Bloomberg.com and on the Bloomberg terminal. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm Taylor Riggs in New York.
And I'm Kevin Cirilli in Washington, D.C. For Bloomberg First Word News, we now go to Mark Crumpton. Mark?
Kevin, Taylor, thank you very much. A top World Health Organization official is walking back her comments that asymptomatic transmission of coronavirus is very rare. During a live event on social media today, Maria Van Kerkhove said her comments stem from a very small group of studies, including unpublished data. She said she was just answering a question, not stating a WHO policy. Van Kerkhove's comments on Monday revived controversy over how the virus spreads. In Iran, the coronavirus outbreak shows no signs of slowing down. The number of daily new cases in Iran remained above 2,000 for the 14th straight day. Iran has had more than 175,000 cases and more than 8,400 deaths. Signs of normalcy are returning to Paris. The Eiffel Tower will reopen on June 25th, following the longest shutdown since World War II. Visitors to the landmark will only be able to access the tower via the stairs and will have to wear masks. It has been closed since March because of the coronavirus pandemic. The Eiffel Tower is the second most visited tourist site in Paris, behind the Louvre Museum. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. Kevin, back to you in Washington.
Thanks, Mark. Let's turn now our attention to the unemployment picture in the United States. Our very own David Weston spoke with U.S. Labor Secretary Eugene Scalia about the surprise rebound in jobs in May.
It was just a stupendous jobs report. As you said, it, in a sense, beat expectations by 10 million jobs. We added 2.5. A lot were in leisure and hospitality, so it was restaurant workers coming back to work. We added a lot in manufacturing, which was a little bit of a surprise, construction, retail. But let me just mention a couple other things that make this report, I think, even more encouraging. First, as you know, these surveys relate to the middle of the month. So this is where we were in mid-May. A lot of states were just starting to reopen now. So we know that you ask where the jobs are, there'll be many more jobs added over the next few weeks in other states that get deeper into their reopening. And then we know there are other industries where we didn't add back as much as we might have expected to, but we'll definitely bring those jobs back. Healthcare lost 1.4 million jobs in April. Those jobs will come back. So it's a really, really good start on the reopening.
Congress enacted, the president signed something called the Payroll Protection Program to try to make sure people either didn't lose their jobs or got hired back. Is there any way of knowing what effect the PPP may have had on these jobs numbers?
We think the PPP was helpful in keeping people on payroll, attached to the employer. Hard to know exactly where it factors in. The Small Business Administration, which administers the program, estimates that tens of millions of workers have gotten the benefit of that program by staying on payroll. And one of the things I've always liked about the program the most, and we've talked about before, is that it poises workers to come back quickly. They're still connected to their employer. The employer still has workers ready to go. So the program, in addition to just getting money to people who need it, should also help us reopen more quickly than we might otherwise have done.
Back when I ran an operating unit at the Walt Disney Company, ABC News, one of the questions I'd ask when things like this happen, nice, surprising numbers, is it timing or is it real? That is to say, are we just moving up some numbers that otherwise we'd see a little later? So does this indicate something about the size of the overall recovery, how many jobs we can get back, or is it more it happened earlier than we thought it would?
I think it's a very good question, and I think it's both. It definitely happened sooner than we expected. What this shows is that the rebound was already happening faster, bigger than projected. But I think the fact that we put back 2.5 million jobs so quickly is encouraging for the long haul. A number that I've looked at closely the last couple months is how many workers say they were put out of work temporarily. And that number remains extremely high. For April, it was just about 90%. And for May, it was about 85% still think that they're going back to the job they had. So that's really another sign that just as we came into this downturn by a completely different route than any other economic difficulty we've had before, we can come out in a different and I think faster way.
This is a great number. I mean, everyone agrees this is a great number. At the same time, we have a long way to go. 2.5 million is almost a drop in the bucket compared to the tens of millions who've lost their jobs here. What comes next, do we think, in terms of getting jobs back, and how long will it take to get us back to where we were?
You're right, David. We still have a ways to go. Nobody's proclaiming victory at this point. We're still working with the states, for example, to help them get those unemployment payments out to people who are entitled to them. That remains a priority. I have been asked a number of times whether I thought we could get back below 10% unemployment this year. I now am even more confident that we can do that. I think this we'll have, I think, a report for the month of June that's at least as positive as the one we saw for May. And I did want to comment on another number in the report. It's been observed that there was a very, very slight uptick in unemployment for African Americans, and that's true. But when you drill in, what you find is that actually about nearly 300,000 African Americans found jobs in May. It's just that they entered the workforce in even larger numbers. And one of the things you look for when you're looking for recovery is increased labor force participation. So that's actually another good sign in this report. We obviously want that unemployment number coming down, but we see that African Americans did get jobs and are coming back into the workforce.
That was part of David Wesson's interview with Labor Secretary Eugene Scalia. It is time now for Stock of the Hour. We're looking at the movie industry as California unveils plans to reopen the state's theaters. Kaylee Lines is here with more. Kaylee, what do we know?
Yeah, Taylor, I want to focus on one stock in particular as it relates to this, and that is Cinemark. Of course, that is one of the biggest theater operators in terms of number of screens. It has about 6,000 of them across the country. The stock is lower by nearly 9% today. Now, part of that is what we're seeing with the broader equity market. Some of the year's most beaten down stocks getting beaten down once again as this rally kind of takes a break here. And when I say beaten down, I really mean it. The stock has lost about half its value so far this year, as have many movie theater operators because of the coronavirus shutdown and the resulting theater shutdowns. But so because of this pandemic, domestic box office revenue has absolutely plunged. It's actually down about 2/3 this year from its peak, only $1.8 billion through yesterday. And Cinemark, for its part, saw revenue fall 24% year on year in the first quarter that it reported last week. Potentially, though, positive catalyst is coming for it. Its peers as economies begin to reopen. Cinemark is initiating a multi-phased reopening beginning on June 19th. And of course, the market in particular we're focused on today is California, because yesterday, California state public health officials submitted guidelines for Governor Gavin Newsom to approve in order to resume operations. Granted, those guidelines do say theater attendance would need to be limited to 25% of capacity when they do reopen, but still one analyst over at MGM Partners says that guidance could improve the chances of the U.S. actually having a summer movie season. He said allowing theaters in L.A. and San Francisco in particular to reopen might be a major factor in Hollywood studios feeling comfortable enough that the country is going to want new feature film content. That means we could see Warner Brothers release Tenet in mid-July and maybe Mulan finally coming out shortly after that.
And Kaylee, I wanted to talk, because we were showing a chart earlier about all the year-to-date losses and, of course, more losses today. What is it going to take to push those stocks back in the green, given yesterday, of course, we were noting the S&P 500 had erased its losses for the year? What is it going to take to get those stocks back in the green?
Yeah, of course, it's a really good question, Taylor, because even with the dramatic rallies we've seen off the lows for many of these beaten down companies, it's still nowhere near enough to recover from the intense pain we'd seen throughout the duration of 2020. I think for theaters in particular, it's going to be a question of when that box office revenue begins to stabilize. Our analysts here at Bloomberg Intelligence don't think it's really going to recover in the second half, because even once theaters reopen, the capacity is still going to be lower and people might still be scared to go to a theater. Even if there are extra health precautions taken, they might not be super excited to go back and sit in a room with a bunch of other strangers.
Yeah, you could say that. Thank you, as always, there to Kaylee Lines. Kevin?
All right, coming up, Congressman Dwight Evans, Democrat of Pennsylvania. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm Taylor Riggs in New York.
And I'm Kevin Cirilli in Washington, D.C. As the funeral for George Floyd happens right now in Houston, Floyd's death has set off protests around the world. And it's also led to Democrats in Congress unveiling a policy reform bill. For more, we are joined by Congressman Dwight Evans. He's a Democrat, and his district includes Center City, Philadelphia. Congressman, I want to get your reaction to the funeral that is underway, and also your sense of gauging whether or not there actually is bipartisan reform that could be enacted from Congress.
Well, the first thing is to the Floyd family, I send my obviously deep-hearted feelings. This is very unfortunate. It should not have occurred. And, you know, Mr. Floyd was a very active person in his community, in Minneapolis, in his home, in terms of Houston. So he obviously This shouldn't have occurred, and it's very unfortunate for all of us throughout America in terms of what has occurred. Where things are here in Philadelphia, I'm in what you call the 3rd Congressional District, where America started with Independence Hall 245 years ago. And I sit on the Ways and Means Committee, and I'm vice chair on the Small Business Committee. You very much have a community that is very much concerned about what is happening. And when you say bipartisan, I would hope it could be bipartisan. I think that the type of reforms that we're talking about are just good sense reforms. There's an attempt to basically bring some sense of order to our policing policy. I don't think those are anything that are outlandish when you talk about no chokehold. When you say things like that, when you talk about tracking individuals who have not been people who have been solid citizens. Look, our police force is very important to all of us, no matter who we are. I don't think it's a question about a Democrat or Republican. I think at the end of the day, police play a very important part in our economic and our commerce. So I'm fully one who understands that we need them and we respect them, but also you cannot have situations where they are abusing the citizen. That is not acceptable. And for those who take that particular kind of position, that's an unacceptable position to take.
Congressman Dwight Evans is joining us. He's a Democrat of Pennsylvania and represents parts of Center City, Philadelphia. Congressman, let me ask you this, because you've been working on these issues even long before the most recent incident that has occurred. But we're hearing so much new terminology, for lack of a better word, in the past several days, like defund the police. What does that specifically mean? Or to abolish police departments? What does that specifically mean? Because when I interview people, I get a different answer depending on who I ask.
Well, first thing is, I don't ever believe you're going to abolish the police or defund the police. I believe that the police have a very important role in our society. And when you think about it, the question is, that's a very difficult job. But it's a job that at the end of the day, like anything, those of us in Congress or state legislators or city council, we have to work together. The police can't solve the problem by themselves, but they also can't be abusive. So at the end of the day, I don't think it should be, Democrats for abolishing police and Republicans are for police. I think that's the wrong argument. The real question is how we grow and move our economy. That's the real question that we should be focused on. And safety and security is a part of this economy. So I don't think you could have a situation where, that those who beat up on it, that's unacceptable. I don't see anybody who doesn't want the police to be available to them. At the end of the day, we do have to make changes. We should not be fearful of change. We should not be fearful of change. Change should be something that we embrace. And that when we see something is occurring that is not acceptable, the package we have introduced yesterday shows, in a sense, we have no fear of change. And we hope that it can be bipartisan.
Congressman, talk to me a little bit more about the specifics of what a bipartisan bill looks like. Is there enough support that it doesn't include defund the police, but yet starts to look at some of the police brutality and some of the tactics? Is that enough to get both sides of the aisle on board?
Well, this bill doesn't include anything with defunding. It basically talks about ideas that makes grants available to individuals who may have creative ideas, right? All the ideas are not in Washington, D.C. At the end of the day, there may be people who have around community policing. Those are things we should embrace. In terms of the chokehold, that should be unacceptable. That should not be an acceptable act that a person takes who's on the police force. Training is very essential. In any workforce we have, we want to make sure people are trained properly. We shouldn't be fearful of training. So training, upgrade, things of that nature to allow it. And then diversity. Diversity is extremely important in any police force. You must have the inclusion of the citizens that you are providing policing to, from the top leadership, from commissioners, superintendents, the sergeant, all those people, because your police force should reflect the community that it comes from.
Well, Congressman, speaking of diversity, I mean, there have been so many reports that have come out that have shown that minority groups are the hardest hit economically during this pandemic. Are you concerned, Congressman, that the mom and pop shops in West Philly are not going to be getting the financial assistance that they need coming from the Fed, coming from banks, because it's going to big businesses? And how do we prevent that?
Well, you raise a very good point. I think when you talk about preventing, you talk about using CDFIs, you talk about using minority business organizations. I think you raise a very legitimate point. And at the end of the day, it's in our self-interest. I call it self-enlightened leadership, because you want the economy to grow and you want it to be an equitable and a diverse economy. It's in our collective interest. That's why you want police officers properly trained, focused on making a difference in our community. It's not us versus the community or the police, vice versa. You want to find a way to how to get people to work in their collective interest. And the collective interest is making sure that business grow. You have African Americans and entrepreneurship, development. You see it. I can point out a number of examples of various businesses who have shown they know what to do. They know how to do, but they want to work together. And that's why I said we should lessen the temperature that's been raised around this situation and try to focus it on what's most important for the people. That's why we're here. We're here for the people. We're not here for ourselves. We're here to find a way that we can do things that work for the people.
Well, it's a busy time, so we always appreciate your perspective. Our thank you there to Congressman Dwight Evans, Democrat of Pennsylvania. And today marks the launch of Bloomberg Green magazine. It's a quarterly collection of our best reporting on climate change. The debut issue explores ways stimulus spending enacted in response to the COVID-19 virus can be used towards climate recovery. It also features an introductory essay by Michael Bloomberg on why the coronavirus crisis will be a turning point for climate change. The magazine is available on Bloomberg.com and on the Bloomberg terminal. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Tomorrow, we will hear from Fed Chairman Jay Powell when the central bank announces its latest rate decision. Markets are pricing in speculation that the Fed will impose curve controls to keep front-end yields in check, with U.S. Treasury markets behaving like yield curve controls are already here. For more analysis, I want to bring in Ira Jersey, U.S. rate strategist for Bloomberg Intelligence. Ira, does yield curve control start tomorrow, or are some analysts and economists thinking maybe it's a September issue?
Yeah, so I don't think that they'll actually enact it tomorrow, but I think that they'll kind of lead the way into it. So I think that Jay Powell in the press conference will probably be asked about it, and he'll mention that it's one of several options that the Fed may consider in the future. But yeah, the August or September meeting is probably more likely just because they have to think about it a little bit more, get staff input, and basically have a plan for how they're going to implement such a program, because it's a little bit different than quantitative easing in that it's more open-ended, and they have to figure out, what levels of yields are they actually going to control. So I think all of those things are going to be part of the discussion and discourse over the next couple of months.
We always love getting perspective from Ira Jersey, U.S. rate strategist for Bloomberg Intelligence, but as always, we're having some technical issues with the line there, so we want to make sure to come and get him back when we can. But Kevin, I'm fortunate that I'm joined here by you right now. I know you're on politics, I'm on Fed. Let's try to marry the two of them together. Very interesting what we just heard from Ira about perhaps waiting until some of September, perhaps. I was listening, though, to an analyst this morning, Subhadra Rajappa over at SocGen, and it might seem a little wonky to say this, but there could be some speculation that yield curve controls by keeping a cap on yields would mean that it is cheaper to fund all this debt that the Treasury is issuing. If yields spike up, our debt costs surge out of control. So that's sort of the marriage that we're starting to see between some of the fiscal and the monetary stimulus that you and I continue to talk about.
Well, Taylor, not even that, but I was just speaking with a source yesterday who said that it's very likely that Treasury Secretary Mnuchin is going to get that topic tomorrow when he testifies before the Senate. And I think even more broadly, what you're noticing in the past several days is this collective sigh of relief coming from many in the administration, including Mnuchin, including Larry Kudlow, as well as others, because of that jobs report on Friday. However, when I was speaking with Robert Shapiro, who's a previous advisor to Democratic presidential candidates like Obama and Clinton, they're scratching their heads and they're rolling their eyes because they don't really share the optimism in the economy. So a lot of different back and forth. But I just got to say, Taylor, I mean, switching gears, what a moment to have the New York Stock Exchange have those 8 minutes of silence at the start of the hour to coincide with the memorial service for George Floyd. Yeah,
you're absolutely right. And with less than a minute left, Kevin, what is your take on this? Has this really been the key focus in your Washington, D.C.?
It really is. And in fact, I do think that there are Republicans, even in rural districts, people like Congressman Denver Riggleman, who want to see something done. They would like to have this be some type of bipartisan moment. But, the politics of this, as we've unfortunately seen, are very, very difficult.
Well,
Thank you, Taylor.
Sure hope that you get past the politics on this.
Yeah. Absolutely. And coming up on Balance of Power, we're going to continue this conversation on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we'll talk to Congressman Dan Beyer of Virginia. And later today, I was speaking with former White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney.